I almost didn't get on that bus because the driver looked straight at me and said, "You can sit anywhere, just don't sit behind her." It was 11:40 p.m. when I finally made it to the stop, the last one on that route before it cut through a stretch of highway that didn't see much traffic after midnight. And I remember checking the schedule twice on my phone because it felt off that there was even a bus running that late. But there it was, listed plain as day, Route 17, final departure, and I had already missed the earlier one because my shift ran late. So I didn't really have a choice, not unless I wanted to pay for a rideshare. That would cost more than I made in half a day, and the stop itself was quiet in that way that small-town transit stops get at night. Just a flickering overhead light and a bench with chipped paint, the kind that feels colder than the air around it. And when the bus finally pulled up, it didn't make that usual sighing sound of air brakes releasing. It just kind of slowed and stopped like it had been gliding, and the doors opened without a word from the driver, and I stepped on expecting at least a nod or a "how's it going?" But he didn't say anything at first, just watched me with this tired expression like he'd been on that route longer than he should have been, and I paid my fare. The machine beeped, normal enough, and that's when he leaned slightly toward me and said it, not loud, not whispering either, just flat, like it was part of the route instructions. "You can sit anywhere, just don't sit behind her." And I remember letting out a small laugh because I thought he was joking, maybe trying to mess with the only passenger he'd picked up in the last hour. But he didn't smile, didn't even look like he expected me to respond, just turned his eyes back to the road as if that settled it. And I hesitated for a second at the front before moving down the aisle, because I figured if there was some kind of situation I'd notice it right away, but the bus was mostly empty. Rows of seats with that worn blue fabric, a few scuff marks on the floor. Nothing out of place except for one thing. There was a woman sitting all the way in the back, on the right side, by the window, and at first glance, she didn't seem unusual, just another late-night passenger trying to get home. Except she wasn't moving at all, not scrolling on a phone, not adjusting her bag, not even shifting her posture the way people do without thinking. She was just sitting there, facing the window, completely still. And I told myself that wasn't strange. Some people just zone out like that, especially late at night. But something about the way she held her head felt fixed, like it had been set in that position and left there, and I chose a seat about halfway down the bus, on the opposite side, close enough to keep an eye on things without making it obvious I was staring. And as the doors closed behind me, the bus pulled back onto the road, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not just the usual hum of the engine or the low rattle you get when you hit uneven pavement, but something deeper, like the sound was being absorbed before it could echo. And I shifted in my seat, glancing toward the back again, and she was still there, same position, same angle, her reflection faint in the window beside her. And I remember thinking it was just the lighting, the way those overhead bulbs flicker slightly when the bus hits a bump, but the reflection didn't look quite right, like it lagged half a second behind where she actually was, and I blinked, trying to shake that off, because it didn't make sense. Reflections don't do that, not unless the glass is warped or there's something else behind it. And I leaned back, telling myself I was just tired, that I'd been on my feet all day and my brain was looking for patterns where there weren't any. And the bus rolled on, passing the last few lit storefronts before the road opened up into that long stretch of highway, the kind where you can drive for miles without seeing another set of headlights. And I checked my phone, signal dropping from 3 bars to 1, then back again, like it couldn't decide if it wanted to stay connected. And when I looked up, I caught the driver's eyes in the rearview mirror, just for a second, and he quickly looked away, like he hadn't meant to make eye contact. And that was when I remembered what he'd said, not sit behind her, and I glanced over my shoulder, counting the rows between us, trying to figure out if I had somehow broken that rule without realizing it. But I hadn't. I was still well ahead of her, nowhere near the back section, and that should have been enough to settle me. But it didn't, because the longer I sat there, the more I noticed how nothing in that bus seemed to change. The lighting stayed the same, the sound stayed muted, and the woman in the back stayed perfectly still, like time wasn't quite moving for her the way it was for the rest of us. And I tried to focus on something normal, the passing road signs, the faint glow of distant streetlights, anything to anchor myself. But every few seconds my eyes would drift back to that reflection in the window, and each time it felt just a little more off, not enough to explain, just enough to make me wonder if I had really seen what I thought I saw. And I remember thinking, Maybe the driver just didn't want people sitting back there because it made it harder to keep track of them. Maybe it was a safety thing, something simple and practical. But then I looked again, really looked, and for a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn the reflection wasn't facing the window anymore. I could have sworn it was angled slightly toward the aisle, like it was looking at me instead, and I felt my hand tighten on the edge of the seat without realizing it. My fingers pressing into that worn fabric as I tried to convince myself it was just the lighting, just the angle, just my eyes playing tricks, but I didn't look back again right away, because something in me didn't want to confirm it. Something in me understood that if I turned around and saw her any closer than she should be, or if that reflection didn't match what was actually there, then whatever. This would stop being something I could explain, and I wasn't ready for that yet. Not on a bus in the middle of nowhere, not with a driver who wouldn't even meet my eyes, and a passenger who hadn't moved once since I stepped on board. I kept telling myself it was just the glass, just the angle, just the kind of thing that happens when you are tired and staring too long at reflections. But the problem was that every time I tried to settle into that explanation, something small would shift and undo it, like the way the overhead lights flickered just slightly whenever we passed through a darker stretch of road, and how in those brief dips, the reflection of the woman in the window seemed to move a fraction of a second before. The bus stabilized again, and I did not want to keep checking. I really did not. But my eyes kept drifting back there, almost on their own, like I was trying to prove to myself that everything was normal, and each time I looked, she was still sitting in the same position, facing the window, completely still, and that should have been reassuring, but it was not, because it felt too consistent, like she was holding that pose instead of naturally sitting in it, and I shifted in my seat again, trying to break the pattern, looking out my own window instead, watching the highway lines blur past under the dim glow of the bus headlights. And for a few seconds I managed to focus on that, counting the reflectors as they passed, letting the rhythm of it steady me. But then the bus hit a slight bump, the kind that should not have mattered, and I heard it, a soft creak from somewhere behind me. Not loud, not sudden, just enough to register as something that did not belong to the engine or the road. And I froze without meaning to, my hand still resting on the edge of the seat, and I listened, waiting for it to happen again. But the bus went quiet, the same muffled quiet it had been since I stepped on, and I told myself it was just the seat frame shifting. Old buses do that. They settle, they make noise, but I still turned my head just slightly, not enough to make it obvious, just enough to catch the back rows in my peripheral vision. And she was still there, same posture, same angle, nothing different. And I let out a slow breath I did not realize I had been holding. But then I noticed something else, something smaller, something I almost missed, the row behind me. The one that had been empty when I first sat down, now looked occupied, not in a clear way, not like I could see someone sitting there, but the seat cushion was pressed down slightly, like there was weight on it, and I leaned forward a little, trying to get a better angle without turning fully around. And as I did, the driver's voice came from the front, calm but firm, stay in your seat. And it startled me more than it should have, because I had not realized he had been watching me through the mirror again. And I quickly straightened, facing forward, trying to play it off like I had just been adjusting. But my heart had started beating faster, not from panic exactly, just from that creeping awareness that something was not lining up the way it should, and I swallowed, glancing at the mirror myself, catching a brief reflection of the driver's eyes, before he looked away again. And I almost asked him what he meant, almost asked why he had said that about not sitting behind her. But something held me back, something about the way he avoided looking too long in that direction, like he was trying not to acknowledge something that was already there. And the bus continued down the highway, mile after mile of dark road stretching ahead, and I checked my phone again. No signal now, just the empty bars where reception should be, and I tapped the screen out of habit, as if that would change anything, but it did not. And when I looked up again, the lights flickered once more, longer this time, just enough to cast the interior into a brief shadow before coming back. And in that instant, I saw it clearly, not just the reflection lagging or shifting, but something worse. The reflection of the woman was no longer aligned with the seat she was actually sitting in. It was one row closer, just slightly forward from where it should have been. And I felt a chill run through me, sharp and immediate. Because there was no way to explain that with lighting or angles, not when I could see both at once, the real figure still at the back, and the reflection sitting closer, as if it had moved independently, and I blinked hard, looking away, then back again, and the reflection snapped into place, matching her position perfectly, like nothing had happened, and I shook my head, pressing my lips together, trying to ground myself in something real, something that made sense. But the more I tried, the more the details around me started to feel off, like the spacing between the seats, the way the aisle stretched longer than I remembered, the distance between me and the front of the bus seeming slightly farther than it should have been, and I leaned forward again, just enough to glance toward the driver, and that was when I noticed something else that I had not before. The reflection in the mirror did not show the full length of the bus behind him. It cut off sooner than it should have, like the back rows were being swallowed by shadow, even though the overhead lights were still on, and I felt that same tightening in my chest, that same instinct telling me not to turn around fully, not to confirm what was happening, but at the same time, another part of me needed to know, needed to check, because the not knowing was starting to feel worse than whatever the truth might be, and I slowly turned my head, inch by inch, until I could see down the aisle without fully twisting my body, and the back of the bus looked exactly the same as before, the rows in place. The woman sitting by the window, still facing away, still unmoving. But now, the row directly behind me, the one I had thought looked pressed down, was definitely not empty anymore. There was a shape there, not fully visible, not clear enough to make out features, but enough to tell that something was occupying that space, and I could feel it without even looking directly, the presence of it. The way the air felt slightly different, heavier, like there was someone sitting just out of sight, and I snapped my head forward again, my hand gripping the seat tighter. And I did not look back after that. I could not, because whatever was happening, it was not staying in the back of the bus anymore. It was getting closer, and I did not need to see it directly to know that. I kept my eyes forward after that, locked on the back of the driver's seat like it was the only solid thing left in the entire bus, because every instinct in me was telling me that if I turned around again, even a little, whatever was behind me would not just stay there. And the worst part was that I could still feel it without looking, that same subtle pressure, like someone sitting too close in a quiet room, not touching you, but close enough that you are aware of every small movement they make. And I tried to focus on the road ahead instead, the thin beam of headlights cutting through the dark, the occasional roadside marker flashing by, anything that felt consistent, but even that started to feel wrong after a while, like the distance between each marker was stretching just slightly, not enough to notice at first, but enough that when I tried to count them again, the rhythm did not match what it should have been, and I swallowed, shifting in my seat just enough to create some space between my back and whatever was behind me, even though I knew it was pointless, because the presence did not move when I did. It just stayed there, steady, patient, and I could hear it now, not clearly, not like a voice or even a defined sound, just a faint irregular noise that did not belong to the engine or the road, something like fabric brushing lightly against itself, or a slow, controlled breath that never quite completed, and I pressed my hand harder into the seat, grounding myself in. The texture of the worn fabric, the small tear near the edge that I could feel under my fingers, trying to remind myself that this was real, that I was still on a bus, still on a road, still in control of what I could see and do. But then the lights flickered again, longer this time, long enough that the interior dropped into a dim, uneven glow instead of full darkness, and in that half-second shift, the reflection in the front mirror changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would make sense right away, but enough that I noticed the shape behind me had a clearer outline now, a head, shoulders, something leaning slightly forward, and my breath caught in my throat as I realized that whatever had been sitting in the row behind me was no longer just a vague impression. It was defined now, more present, more real, and I did not want to confirm it by turning around, but I could not ignore the mirror either, and I stared at it, watching the way the image held steady for a moment before snapping back to something more normal when the light stabilized again, and I shook my head, quietly, almost without meaning to, because that kind of shift should not happen, not without something physically moving to cause it. And I had not heard anything move, not a step, not a shift of weight, nothing. And that was when I noticed the driver again, or rather, the absence of something about him. His hands were still on the wheel, the bus was still moving straight down the road, but his posture had changed slightly, more rigid, like he was holding himself in place rather than naturally steering. And I leaned forward just a little, trying to get a better look without drawing attention, and I saw that his eyes were not scanning the road the way they should have been. They were fixed ahead, unblinking, like he was focusing on something far beyond the windshield. And I felt that same cold awareness settle in, because it was not just the back of the bus that was wrong anymore. It was everything: the driver, the spacing, the way the bus seemed to glide instead of drive. And I opened my mouth slightly, thinking about saying something, anything, just to break the silence. But the words did not come out, because the moment I considered it, the faint sound behind me shifted again, closer this time, like whatever was there had leaned in just a little more, and I froze, every muscle tightening as I tried not to react, because reacting would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it might make it worse. And I focused on my breathing instead, slow, controlled, counting each inhale and exhale in my head, trying to keep it steady, but it did not help, because with each breath, I became more aware of the fact that something else was breathing too, not in sync with me, not even at the same pace, just there, slightly offset, like it was following its own rhythm right behind me. And I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, then opened them again, forcing myself to look at the mirror once more. And this time the image did not snap back right away. It lingered, just long enough for me to see that the shape behind me was leaning closer than before, and beyond that, further down the aisle, the woman at the back had changed too, not in position, not in the way she was sitting, but in the way she was reflected, because now, for the first time, the reflection did not show a face at all, not even a shadow where one should be, just an absence, a blank space where features should have been. And I felt something in my chest drop, that instinctive understanding that whatever I had been trying to rationalize was no longer something I could explain away. And I turned my head just slightly, just enough to see the edge of the seat behind me without fully facing it. And I saw it then, not clearly, not in full detail, but enough, a shape occupying that space, closer than it should have been. And I jerked forward again, gripping the seat in front of me as the bus continued down the empty highway. And I realized, with a clarity that cut through every attempt at denial, that whatever had started at the back of the bus was not staying there. It was moving forward, one row at a time, and it was almost at me. I did not move after that realization, not at first, because moving meant making a decision, and I was not sure which direction was safer anymore, staying still or getting up. And for a few seconds I just sat there with my hands gripping the seat in front of me, listening, counting the seconds between each flicker of the overhead lights, trying to predict when the next shift would happen, because that was the only pattern I had left. And I noticed that it was not random. It came every time we passed through a darker stretch of road. Every time the headlights had nothing to reflect off except empty asphalt and distant tree lines. And I focused on that, watching the road ahead, waiting for the next long patch of darkness. And when it came, I braced myself, my shoulders tightening, my breath slowing without me meaning to, and the lights flickered again, longer this time, stretching just enough that the inside of the bus felt disconnected from the outside world, like we were moving through something thicker than air. And I looked at the mirror, even though I knew I should not. And this time there was no delay, no subtle shift. The shape behind me was clearly closer, leaning forward into the aisle, and I could see the outline of where a face should have been, but there was nothing there. Just a smooth absence that did not reflect light the way it should have, and my stomach dropped in a way that felt physical, like I had missed a step on a staircase. And I snapped my eyes forward again, my heart starting to beat faster now, not controlled anymore. And I realized I could not stay in that seat, not with whatever that was sitting directly behind me, because even without turning around, I could feel how close it was, the space between us shrinking with every second. And I pushed myself up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, because I did not know if it would react to that. And I stepped into the aisle, keeping my eyes forward, not looking back, not acknowledging it. And I took one step toward the front, then another, my shoes making a soft sound against the floor that felt too loud in the silence. And as I moved, I noticed something else, something that should not have been possible. The distance to the front of the bus did not feel the same as it had before. It felt longer, like the aisle had stretched, the rows of seats extending further than they should have. And I kept walking anyway, because stopping was not an option. and I reached the row just behind the driver, my hand brushing against the seat as I steadied myself, and I leaned slightly toward him, not fully turning, just enough to speak without raising my voice, and I said, "Hey, is there another stop coming up soon?" And he did not respond right away, not with words, just a slight tightening of his grip on the wheel. And then, after a second that felt too long, he said, without looking at me, "It does not stop unless it has to." And that answer did not make sense, not in any normal way, because buses stop at designated points. That is how routes work, and I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but before I could, the lights flickered again, harder this time, and I saw it in the mirror, not just the shape behind me, but the rows themselves shifting, like the back of the bus was compressing, closing the distance between each seat, pushing whatever was there forward faster than it should have been able to move. And I took another step toward the driver, closer now, almost, at the front, and I said, a little louder, "Can you just pull over?" And this time he did look at me, but only for a second, and there was something wrong with his expression, not fear, not confusion, just a kind of tired acceptance, like he had seen this before and knew how it ended. And he shook his head slightly, almost apologetically, and said, "If it catches up, it will not matter where we stop." And I felt that sentence settle into me in a way I could not ignore, because it meant he knew. He understood what was happening, and he was not trying to fix it, and that realization pushed something in me to act, because if the driver was not going to help, then I had to do something myself, and I moved past the first row, stepping closer to the front door, reaching out to grab the metal pole for balance as the bus continued forward, and I looked down at the door mechanism, trying to remember how these things worked, whether there was a manual release or a button I could press, but everything looked locked, sealed, like it was not meant to be used while the bus was moving. And I glanced back toward the mirror again, just for a split second, and that was enough. The shape was no longer confined to the row behind where I had been sitting. It was in the aisle now, closer than ever, and the absence where its face should have been was turned directly toward me. And I felt a sharp spike of panic cut through the controlled fear I had been holding on to, and I turned fully toward the front again, my hand tightening around the pole as I said, more urgently, "Then slow down, just slow down." And the driver did not answer this time. He just kept staring ahead, his posture rigid, his hands fixed on the wheel, and I realized that whatever control I thought he had over this situation was gone, if it had ever been there at all. And behind me, I could feel it again, that presence, no longer just close, but almost within reach, and I knew, without needing to look, that it had moved into the space I had just left, and it was not stopping. I kept one hand on the metal pole by the door and the other hovering near the panel, trying to figure out if there was anything I could press, anything that would force the door open, but the buttons were unlit, dead, like they were not even connected to anything anymore, and I tapped one anyway, just to be sure, but nothing happened, no sound, no response. And I felt that tight pressure in my chest grow heavier because it meant I did not have an easy way out, not while the bus was moving, and I could feel it behind me again, closer now than it had ever been, close enough that I could almost sense the space it occupied, like the air itself was being displaced, and I did not turn around. I refused to, because I already knew what I would see in the mirror. I had seen enough of it already, that smooth absence where a face should have been, that impossible way it moved only when the light shifted, and I forced myself to think, to stay practical, because panic was not going to help me here, and I told myself there had to be a reason for this, something mechanical, something environmental, something I could still explain if I looked at it the right way. Maybe the lights were causing visual distortions, maybe the mirror was warped, maybe the bus itself was older than it looked and things were just off. But even as I tried to build those explanations, they kept falling apart under the weight of what I had already seen, and I glanced at the driver again, hoping for something. Any kind of reaction that would tell me this was still within the range of normal, but he had not moved, not even slightly, his hands still fixed on the wheel, his eyes still locked forward, and I realized then that I had not heard him breathe in a while, not in the way you normally notice when someone is sitting right in front of you, just the subtle rise and fall, the quiet shift of air, and that absence made something in me tighten even more, because it meant I was not the only one who felt wrong in this space. And I swallowed, my mouth dry now, and I tried again, keeping my voice steady. There has to be a way to stop this thing. And this time he responded, but not the way I expected. He said, very quietly, "It stops when it is empty." And that answer hit me in a way I could not ignore, because it did not sound like a rule of transit. It sounded like a rule of something else entirely. And I shook my head slightly, trying to push that thought away, trying to stay grounded in something real. And I looked down at the door again, running my fingers along the edge where the panels met, searching for a latch or a seam that might give me something to work with. And that was when the bus slowed. Just a little, not enough to stop, but enough that I felt the shift in momentum. And I looked up instinctively, my eyes going to the windshield, and I saw something ahead that I had not noticed before, a faint glow off to the right side of the road, like a roadside stop or a small pull-off area. And my heart lifted just slightly at the sight of it, because it meant there was somewhere we could actually stop, somewhere I could get off. And I tightened my grip on the pole, leaning forward, just enough to see it more clearly as we approached. And it looked like an old stop, a sign with faded lettering, a small patch of pavement branching off from the highway. Nothing official, nothing well lit, but it was something, and I turned slightly toward the driver, about to say something, but before I could, the lights flickered again, harder than before, and I saw it in the reflection of the windshield this time, not the mirror, but the faint reflection that overlays the glass when the lighting inside shifts, and the shape behind me was no longer just in the aisle. It was directly behind my shoulder, close enough that if I leaned back even slightly, I would be touching it, and I felt my breath catch, my body going rigid as I realized how little space there was left between us, and I forced myself not to react, not to jerk away or turn around, because something told me that would only make it worse, and I focused on the road ahead instead, on that small pull-off area that was getting closer with every second, and I said, more urgently now, "Pull over there. Just stop there." And the driver did not answer, but the bus began to drift slightly toward the right, not sharply, not like a deliberate turn, but enough that it was clear we were heading toward that area, and I felt a flicker of hope push through the fear, because if I could just get off the bus, if I could just put distance between me and whatever was behind me, then maybe this would end. Maybe it was tied to the bus itself, to the route, to something about this place. And I tightened my grip on the pole, preparing myself to move the moment the bus slowed enough. But as we got closer, something else became clear. The sign by the pull-off was not just faded, it was wrong. The letters did not match any stop name I recognized. They looked worn down to the point of being almost unreadable, and the pavement itself looked older than it should have been, cracked in ways that did not line up with the rest of the road, like it had been left unused for a long time. And that flicker of hope wavered, just slightly, because something about it felt off, like it did not belong to the current route, like it was not meant for buses that were still in service. And the lights flickered again as we drew closer, and this time, I did not need to look at any reflection to know what had changed, because I felt it, right at my back, that same pressure, now undeniable, like something was leaning in, closing the last bit of distance between us, and I realized, with a clarity that cut through everything else, that even if the bus stopped, even if the doors opened, I might not have enough time to get away before it reached me. The bus did not stop completely when we reached that pull-off. It just slowed enough that I could feel the shift in speed, the slight drag as the tires rolled over rougher pavement, and I tightened my grip on the pole, bracing myself, because I knew this was the only chance I was going to get, and I leaned forward, watching the door, waiting for any sign that it might open on its own, but it stayed shut, the panels sealed tight like before, and I realized I was going to have to force it, somehow, and I moved my hand down along the edge again, pressing harder this time, feeling for any give in the frame, any weakness I could use, but it did not move, not even a fraction, and behind me, I felt it again, closer than ever, not just a presence anymore, but a pressure that felt almost directional, like something was focusing on me specifically, narrowing the space until there was nowhere left to step back to, and I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still for one more second, because I needed to time this right. I needed to move the moment the bus slowed just a little more, and as if responding to that thought, the bus dipped again, the engine sound lowering, the motion smoothing out as we rolled deeper into the pull-off area, and I took that as my cue. I shifted my weight forward, lifting my hand from the pole and placing both hands against the door, pushing hard, not expecting it to open, but needing to try anyway. And for a moment, nothing happened, just the solid resistance of metal against my palms. And then, with a soft, almost reluctant sound, the door gave slightly, not fully opening, just enough to create a narrow gap between the panels, and I felt a rush of cold air slip through, sharp and immediate, carrying with it the smell of something old, like damp pavement and dust that had not been disturbed in a long time. And I did not hesitate after that. I pushed harder, forcing the gap wider, and the door resisted again before giving just enough for me to slip through, and I stepped out onto the ground without looking back, my shoes hitting the uneven pavement as I stumbled forward a few steps, catching myself with my hands against my knees as I tried to steady my breathing. And for a second, just a second, I felt something close to relief, because I was off the bus. I had put distance between myself and whatever had been behind me, and I straightened slowly, turning just enough to see the side of the bus without fully facing it. And it was still there, idling quietly, the interior lights flickering faintly through the windows. And I could not see clearly inside from this angle, just vague shapes and shadows, but I knew it was still there, still inside. And I took another step back, then another, increasing the distance between me and the door, because I did not trust it. I did not trust that it would stay inside just because I had stepped out. And I looked around then, really looked at where I was standing, and the pull-off was worse than I had thought from the road. The pavement was cracked and uneven, the painted lines barely visible, and the sign I had seen earlier was closer now, its surface worn down to the point where only fragments of letters remained, nothing I could piece together into a real stop name. And beyond that, there was nothing, no buildings, no lights, just darkness stretching out on either side of the highway. And that sense of isolation hit me harder now that I was outside, because at least on the bus there had been the illusion of movement, of direction, but here, it felt like I had stepped into a place that had been left behind, forgotten, and I took another step back, my eyes flicking to the bus again. And that was when I noticed something that made my chest tighten all over again. The driver had not moved. He was still sitting there, hands on the wheel, staring forward, exactly as he had been before. And for a moment I wondered if he had even noticed that I had gotten off, if he was aware of anything at all, and I almost called out to him, almost asked if he was going to keep going. But the words caught in my throat, because something about the stillness inside. That bus felt heavier now, like it was holding something in place, and I did not want to draw its attention back to me. And I took another step back, then another, putting more distance between myself and the door. And that was when the lights inside flickered again, harder than before, and I saw it, just for a second, through the side window, a shape moving toward the front, not walking, not in any normal way, but shifting from one position to the next as the light cut in and out. And I felt that same cold realization settle in, because it meant it had not stopped when I got off. It was still moving forward, still following the same pattern, and the only difference now was that I was no longer inside with it. And I told myself that meant I was safe, that I had broken whatever connection there was. But even as I thought it, something about the way the bus was sitting there, idling in that empty pull-off, made me question it, because it had not driven away, it had not closed its doors and continued down the route. It was still there, like it was waiting. And I took another step back, my eyes fixed on it, and for a moment, nothing changed. The lights flickered, the shadows shifted, but the bus did not move. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the front door began to open again. Not from the inside where I had pushed it, but on its own, the panels sliding apart with that same reluctant sound, and I felt my breath catch, because I knew what that meant. It was not just letting me off anymore. It was opening for something else, and I stood there, frozen for a second, watching as the gap widened, the dark interior of the bus visible through the opening, and I realized, with a clarity that cut through every attempt at reassurance, that stepping off the bus had not ended anything. It had just changed where I was standing when it reached the front. I did not move when the door opened again, not right away, because something about the way it happened felt wrong in a way that went beyond everything else I had already seen. It was too smooth, too deliberate, like the bus itself was responding to something that was no longer inside it. And I stood there a few feet back from the entrance, my body tense, my eyes fixed on the dark opening as the interior lights flickered behind it. And for a moment nothing came out, nothing stepped forward, and I almost convinced myself that maybe it was just a mechanical glitch, that maybe the door had reopened because I had forced it earlier, but then I saw it. Not directly, not clearly, but in the shifting reflection on the glass panel beside the door, a movement that did not match anything physical I could track, a shape passing through the space where the aisle should have been. And I felt that same tightening in my chest as my brain tried to catch up to what I was seeing, because it was not walking, it was not moving in steps. It was appearing closer, then closer again. Each time the light inside flickered, and I took another step back without thinking, my heels scraping against the rough pavement as I tried to put more distance between myself and the bus. But at the same time I could not look away, because not looking felt worse somehow, like it would let it close the gap without me even knowing, and I focused on the doorway, on the thin line where the light from inside met the darkness outside, and I saw it then, just at the edge of that light, a form beginning to fill the space, not fully solid, not defined in the way a person should be, but enough that I could tell it was there, and my breath caught as I realized it was no longer confined to reflections or shadows. It was at the threshold now, right where I had stepped out moments ago, and I took another step back, then another, my movement slow and controlled, because I did not want to trigger anything. I did not know if sudden movement would make it react faster, and I kept my eyes locked on that doorway as the shape seemed to pause there, not moving forward, not retreating, just occupying that space like it was deciding something. And for a second, just a second, I thought maybe it could not leave the bus. Maybe there was some boundary it could not cross. And that idea gave me just enough hope to keep from freezing completely, and I shifted my weight again, preparing to turn and run if I had to. Because even if it could not leave, I did not want to be standing this close when it tried, and I glanced briefly down the road, looking for any sign of headlights, any sign of another car that might be passing through. But the highway was empty, completely empty, the same way it had been since I got on. And when I looked back at the bus, the shape at the doorway had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was closer to the edge now, closer to the outside, and I felt that hope falter, because it meant it was not being held in place. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, and I took another step back, increasing the distance, my eyes never leaving that opening, and I realized I needed to create more space, not just a few feet, but enough that if it did step off, I would have time to react, and I turned slightly, angling my body away from the bus while still keeping it in my peripheral vision, and I started to move further down the pull-off, each step careful, measured, because I did not want to lose sight of it completely, and as I moved, the lights inside the bus flickered again, longer this time, and in that extended dimness, I saw it more clearly than before, the outline of a figure standing at the doorway, facing outward, but where its face should have been, there was nothing, not shadow, not darkness, just an absence that did not reflect the light at all, and I felt a sharp drop in my stomach as that image locked into place, because it confirmed everything I had been trying not to fully accept, and I stopped moving for a second, just long enough to steady myself. And that was when I noticed something else, something I had not paid attention to before. The bus itself was still idling, but the sound was wrong. It was too even, too steady, like it was not coming from an engine at all. And I glanced briefly toward the front windshield, and the driver was still there, still in the same position, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. But now, with the door open and the interior lights flickering, I could see him more clearly. And something about him did not look right either. Not in the way he was sitting, but in the way he was reflected in the glass, because his reflection did not move with the flickering light the way it should have. It stayed fixed, like it was part of the bus rather than a person inside it, and I felt that realization settle in alongside everything else, that whatever this was, it was not just one thing, it was the entire space, the bus, the route, the stop, all of it tied together in a way that I could not separate myself from just by stepping off. And behind me, the darkness of the highway stretched out, offering no help, no escape beyond distance. And I knew then that standing here was not going to keep me safe, because if it could reach the doorway, if it could stand there and face me without a face, then the only thing I had left was how far away I could get before it decided to follow. And I took another step back, then another, turning more fully now, ready to move faster if I had to, but I did not run yet, not until I saw it do something more. Something that confirmed it could leave, and I kept my eyes on it, watching as it remained. In that doorway, still, waiting, And for a moment, everything held in place, the flickering light, the open door, the empty road. And then, slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, one of its feet, or what should have been a foot, shifted forward, crossing the line between the inside of the bus and the outside world. The moment that shape crossed the edge of the doorway, something in me snapped out of that frozen hesitation, and I turned fully, my body moving before my thoughts could catch up, and I started walking faster down the pull-off, not running yet, but pushing my pace hard enough that my steps came quick and uneven against the cracked pavement, and I kept glancing back over my shoulder, unable to stop myself. Because I needed to know how fast it was moving, I needed to know if I still had time. And the first time I looked back, it was still at the doorway, only partially outside, its form unclear in the flickering light, but definitely beyond the threshold now. And I felt that sharp spike of urgency push through me, because that meant the boundary I had hoped for did not exist, and I picked up my pace, my breathing starting to lose its rhythm as I moved further away from the bus, the darkness around the pull-off closing in the farther I went, and I tried to focus on the road ahead, on the faint outline of the highway stretching into the distance, because if I could just reach it, if I could get onto the main road, maybe I would have a better chance of finding help. But even as I thought that, I knew how empty it had been, how little traffic there was at this hour, and I risked another glance back, and this time it was further out, no longer framed by the doorway, standing just beyond it on the pavement, and the way it had moved did not match the time that had passed. It should not have been that far forward already, not without steps, not without motion I could track, and I felt my pace shift from fast walking to something closer to running, my feet hitting the ground harder now, my arms moving instinctively to balance me as I put more distance between us, and the sound of the bus behind me faded slightly, replaced by the hollow quiet of the open road, and I kept going, not stopping, not slowing, because every instinct in me was telling me that distance was the only thing that mattered now. And I glanced back again, and the bus looked farther away than it should have, like it had been left behind more quickly than my movement could account for. But the shape was closer, standing in the middle of the pull-off now, facing in my direction, and I could not see a face, not even a shadow of one, just that same absence that seemed to absorb the light around it. And I felt a cold wave of realization pass through me, because it meant that whatever it was not bound by the same sense of space or time that I was, and running might not be enough, and I forced myself to keep going anyway, because stopping would definitely not help, and I reached the edge of the pull-off where it met the highway, stepping onto the smoother asphalt as I looked both ways out of habit, even though I knew there was nothing coming, and I turned left, choosing a direction at random, because staying in place was not an option, and I started moving along the side of the road, my pace uneven now, somewhere between a jog and a run, and I glanced back again, and this time, the bus was barely visible, its lights dim in the distance, but the shape was not near it anymore. It was closer, much closer, standing on the edge of the pull-off where I had just been, and I felt my chest tighten as I realized how quickly it had covered that distance without any visible movement, and I pushed myself harder, my breath coming faster now, my legs starting to burn as I tried to maintain the pace, and I focused on the road ahead, on the faint white line marking the shoulder, using it as a guide to keep myself steady, and I told myself not to look back again, not to check, because it was not going to help, it was only going to make the fear worse. But after a few seconds, I could not help it. I turned my head again, just for a quick glance, and it was there, not at the pull-off anymore, not in the distance, but on the road behind me, closer than it should have been, closer than it had any right to be given how little time had passed, and I felt that last bit of controlled thinking break apart, replaced by something more urgent, more instinctive, and I pushed into a full run, my steps uneven but fast, my focus narrowing to the space directly in front of me, because I did not have the capacity to process anything else now, and I kept going, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears, the steady rhythm of my feet against the pavement grounding me just enough to keep moving, and I did not look back again for several seconds, forcing myself to keep my eyes forward, but I could still feel it, that same presence, not behind me in a way I could measure, but somewhere in that space, closing the gap in ways that did not follow any rules I understood, and I realized then that I was not just running from something physical, something that moved through space the way I did, I was running from something that could reduce that space whenever it wanted, and that thought hit me harder than anything else, because it meant there was no safe distance, no point where I could stop and feel secure, and I felt my pace falter for a fraction of a second as that realization set in, and that was when I heard it, not a footstep, not a clear sound, but a subtle shift in the air behind me, like something had changed position without needing to move, and I forced myself forward again, pushing through the fatigue building in my legs, because stopping was not an option, not now, not when it was this close, and I kept going, the dark road stretching out ahead of me, offering no clear destination, only the hope that if I kept moving, if I did not slow down, I might stay just far enough ahead to matter, even if I did not fully understand what I was trying to outrun. I did not know how long I had been running. It could have been seconds or minutes, because the road ahead never seemed to change, the same stretch of dark asphalt, the same faint white line along the shoulder, the same empty horizon with no lights, no signs, nothing to mark distance in a way that made sense, and my breathing had turned uneven now, sharp pulls of air that did not feel like enough, my legs starting to feel heavier with each step, but I forced myself to keep moving because every time I slowed, even slightly, I could feel it again, that shift in the space behind me, like something adjusting to match my pace without actually following it, and I tried not to think about that. I tried to focus on something real, something measurable, but there was nothing, just the road and the darkness and the sound of my own footsteps. And then I saw it, far ahead at first, just a faint shape against the dark, something low and rectangular near the side of the road, and I narrowed my eyes, trying to make it out as I kept moving. And as I got closer, it resolved into something familiar, something that should not have been there, a bus stop sign, old and worn, standing at the edge of the highway like it had been left behind, and my stomach dropped as I recognized it, because it was the same kind of sign that had been at the pull-off, the same faded lettering, the same cracked base, and I slowed slightly, not by choice but because my body hesitated, because something about seeing it again did not make sense. I had been moving away from that place. I had put distance between myself and the bus, and yet here was another stop, just like it, and I shook my head, trying to push that thought aside, because stopping was not an option, not when I could still feel that presence somewhere behind me, closing in, without needing to move the way I did, and I forced myself forward again, my pace uneven but steady enough to keep going. And as I got closer to the sign, I noticed something else. The ground around it was not just cracked, it was the same pattern of cracks I had seen at the pull-off, the same uneven lines, the same worn texture, like it was not a different place at all, just another copy of the same one. And I felt a wave of confusion push through the fear, because that should not have been possible. Roads do not repeat like that. They do not loop in ways that bring you back to the same place without turning, and I risked a glance back, just for a second, and what I saw made my chest tighten even more. The bus was there again, not far behind me, sitting at the edge of the pull-off like it had never moved, its lights flickering faintly, and the door was still open, and I felt something in me drop, because it meant I had not gotten away from it at all, not in any real sense. I had been moving, running as fast as I could, and yet the distance between us had not changed the way it should have, and I turned forward again quickly, my breathing growing more uneven as I tried to process that, because it meant that whatever this was, it was not just following me, it was keeping me within reach no matter how far I tried to go, and I reached the sign, slowing just enough to pass it, and I glanced at it as I went by, trying to read what little of the lettering remained, but it was too worn, too faded to make out anything useful, and I kept moving, pushing myself forward again, because stopping here would not change anything, and I told myself that maybe if I kept going, if I did not give in to that confusion, I might still find a way out. But even as I thought it, I could feel that same presence behind me again, closer than before, and I did not need to look back to know that it had moved, that it had reduced whatever distance I had managed to create. And I felt that sharp edge of panic return, cutting through the exhaustion that was starting to slow me down, and I pushed harder, my steps coming faster again, my focus narrowing to the road ahead. But it did not help, because after a few more seconds, I saw it again, another sign, the same shape, the same worn edges, appearing ahead of me like I had not passed one already, and I felt my pace falter, just for a moment, because it confirmed what I had been trying not to accept. I was not moving away from anything. I was moving through the same space over and over, and that realization hit me harder than anything else had so far, because it meant there was no direction that led out, no path that took me somewhere safe, and I slowed without meaning to, my body reacting to that understanding before my mind could fully process it, and I turned my head again, more slowly this time, because I already knew what I was going to see, and the bus was there, closer now, sitting in the same position relative to me as before, its lights flickering, its door open, and in that open doorway, the shape was no longer inside or just outside. It was on the road now, between the bus and where I stood, and I felt my breath catch as I realized how little distance there was left, and I stopped moving entirely, not because I wanted to, but because something in me understood that running was no longer changing anything, and I stood there for a second, my chest rising and falling unevenly as I looked at it, really looked this time. And even in the dim light, I could see that same absence where its face should have been, that same smooth void that did not reflect anything, and I felt a strange kind of clarity settle in, because for the first time since this started, I understood something about it. Not what it was, not where it came from, but how it worked. It did not need to chase me in the way I had been imagining. It did not need to close the distance step by step. It only needed me to keep moving within the space it controlled, and the moment I slowed, the moment I stopped trying to outrun it, it had already positioned itself where it needed to be, and I stood there, the road stretching out behind me and ahead of me in the same endless pattern, the bus idling in the distance, and the shape between us, and I realized that whatever happened next was not going to depend on how fast I could run anymore. It was going to depend on whether I could break whatever loop I was caught in before it reached me.